Reactive training systems.
Welcome back to the RTS podcast. I am Coach Mike Tushir, and today I'm talking to Coach Andrew. We're going to talk about technique. We're going to get really into the details of like what our beliefs are regarding technique, which really centers around this principle of self-organized. We think that there's a lot of detail, a lot of nuance to being really good, really skilled at executing the power lifts. And we think that the best teacher for figuring all that out is movement. So we'll get into all the details about this and about why we think this is the best way to develop technique for lifters. And I think you're going to take away some gems from this one. And it may not be so much like, oh, I need to squat like this, or I need to push my knees out, or I need to brace in this certain way. It's going to be more exploratory than that. It's going to be more processed than that. But ultimately, I think it's going to have a much bigger impact on your training than that. So not a lot of preamble for this one, not a lot of housekeeping that we need to do. So we're just going to jump right into it. This is Coach Andrew and I having a conversation about technical development. How are you, man?
Good. I'm just hanging in there. Training is going well. I've got back-to-back meets coming up. I've got a USAPL meet, and then 2 weeks later, I've got an RPS wrapped meet. So it'll be fun to try to prep into both of those because I don't have to hit any sort of QT or anything. It's just both for fun. So the prep is really fun. It's been fun to work it out with John, what we're doing, because throwing on wraps has just been so interesting and novel and fun. So, having a good time.
What about it? What do you enjoy?
It's it provides just enough novelty where the same amount of stuff, or the same stuff, works for like sleeve squats. The same broad principles all work really similarly, but it's like, wow, I can throw on these wraps and I have to change a couple key things about how I'm moving. I have to change slightly how I'm programming, and then just like using the kit is really fun. Like figuring out how to use the wraps, and then also being able to just squat pretty heavy weights is fun.
Yeah.
So
It'd be weird if you didn't like that. Like, this is not the sport for people that don't like that. So I don't know, man. I dig it. I think there's something to be said for the novelty in a lot of this stuff. Like just mixing it up, like mixing up the stimulus of it as well, I mean, it's interesting because like I would hear and still do hear people talk about this with equipped, like, oh, well, maybe like having a run of equipped lifting would be beneficial to your classic lifting, or, something like that. And I don't think it works that way for the most part. It can, like, it's not unheard of, but usually like when I'm looking at block reviews from people that like run both, the equipped stuff does not like directly transfer to like raw strength, but like some minor things like squatting with wraps, I see that sometimes, and like slingshot bench, like I'll see that pop up sometimes, so like a little bit of equipped stimulus can be helpful, and but then
yeah,
like too far in that direction, it stops transferring.
I will say I tried out a bench shirt. Like I've only tried it like twice, but I hit like a 240 bench in a shirt, which is like way above my raw max. Right before I had all my my fourth bench day of the week, not a high priority, so I just tried out the bench shirt right before it. And I will say the bench, like my raw work, has never felt better. It wasn't like super clicked in, but I unracked, I think it was like 170, and I'm like, oh, this hasn't felt like this light ever. And I think the RPE was like right on target for what I needed it to be, but it has never felt so light and good. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think, I mean, it's probably telling about me that like this is how I relate to people and stuff, but like when people talk about, doing things to help their confidence, that never really made sense to me, except in the context of like what you're talking about. Like you can, get accustomed to like heavier weights, and then, it's still heavy, but it's just classic weights, suddenly feel much lighter, That can be a little disorienting too, though. Like, I remember when I was training for a lot of equipped stuff, I would take out some, whatever it was, it would be, let's say a heavy single done raw, and it would feel super light. It's just that there was not any juice at the bottom, like you push and nothing happened. It feels light, but like that's frustrating in its own way, So I don't know. I mean, like a lot of things, I guess, maybe it's a little bit is good. Too much is not so good. The dose makes the poison, or something like that.
Yeah, with reps specifically, that exact feeling is that you just described is really pertinent, because especially with reps, I mentioned this, I think I was talking to John, but it's like reps don't seem to do anything for my squat unless I'm at least like an 8 out of 10 arousal and I can't focus on the pain of the reps. But when you are taking like a heavy, like fearful, like there's like, oh, this is a lot of weight, and taking that kind of set, it feels like you're just like the pain goes out of my brain, and it feels like I'm just sitting down on these cushions that are just like, yes, squat like so comfortably. It's like a big pillow at the bottom. I wouldn't say it's the same for a bench shirt, because I'm like physically pulling the part of my chest, but at least in reps, it feels like, oh yeah, like this big cushion that's just pushing into. And if I take like 60% in reps, it's brutal. It feels terrible.
I wonder if it's similar to a slingshot, in that, like, not that slingshots ever really hurt in the same way that like wraps are uncomfortable, but in that same sort of like pillow kind of rebound effect.
Yeah. It's really funny.
Yeah. Anyway, let's jump into our topic of the day here. We wanted to jump on the call and talk about technique. And this is like a topic that comes up now and then, right? And it's come up in a number of different conversations that we've had over the last like several months. And I thought it would be interesting to talk to you and like get your thoughts and inputs on this, and then kind of share what I'm thinking too, as far as what's changed, if anything, as we continue to learn and develop. So yeah, I guess maybe a good place for us to start is just by talking about technique and what different types of technique we see existing like in the powerlifting space. I mean, that's one of the things that stands out to me immediately, is that you see really talented lifters all show different kinds of technique, and there's all these different ways for technique to show up, right? So like one of the classics, like some of the classics are going to be like things like stance width and grip width, but even beyond that, like some people tend to really sit into their knees more. Other people sit back a lot more. Some people like are more hip dominant, and other people quad dominant. And you will see not as much. I don't think there's kind of as much diversity in something like the bench press. I think the bench press tends to be pretty similar bar paths, and like you see different grip widths, but the task itself is pretty constrained. And then with the deadlift, you see quite a lot of variation, maybe the most actually, once you account for things like changes in back position, stance, and like the difference between sumo and conventional is pretty notable as well. Yeah, like is that kind of how you Does that weigh into how you view technique as well? Like, are you looking at what top athletes are doing? Does that factor into your framework?
Yes, and no, because I think it's hard to have a really thorough discussion on technique without taking into account survivorship bias and noticing that, hey, all these, like, I watched a video a couple years ago, I think it was a David Wilson video, and he was describing lockout mechanics in a deadlift. And he was like, hey, some people will tell you need to do this and this and this. And at the same time, it's like, people will tell you need to do this and this and this. And you see these in all these top lifters. And you see these in all these like deadlift world record holders. And that just probably doesn't work for you. You have to kind of change based on how you are built, what your strengths, your weaknesses are. So I think there's definitely some big things in like all the lifts that attract people to certain things. And there's a reason why most people use the leg drive and most people, squat with, nobody's squatting like, unless you're like one of those multiply guys, nobody's squatting like completely out, super wide. So there's things that attract people to certain techniques, but I tend not to try to look at top lifters for that. I think it's a really good sample to grab from because those are people who are excellent in their technique. And at the same time, I try to look at what people with quote unquote poor technique, what they're doing and how they're solving problems for their builds, their leverages. And at the same time, this is just me, I tend to be pretty technique agnostic. It's like, I don't really care about technique. Like, I care about technique because ultimately that's how you're moving. And at the same time, if you are lifting to a comp standard and you are getting something that will pass in a competition and you add 100 kilos to a lift, but you have quote unquote really inefficient and poor technique visually, according to what someone would determine, I'm fine with that. There are some people, I've heard this like all the time, people being like, oh, your coach didn't do blank technique thing. How could you ever, like, that's a bad coach. Like they didn't fix this technical problem. And I'm like, not that I think that I do that, but if someone were to tell me that for one of my athletes, then I'm like, hey, but I put 50 kilos on their squat. Like,
Yeah.
does it really matter? I don't know. So I tend to be pretty agnostic on technique.
I'm with you to an extent. And I mean, I think it's interesting to kind of explore like what some of the limits of these things would be. I don't like, I try not to nitpick technique very much because like you say, it's like solving movement problems, and people are going to have different ways of doing that. And for the most part, I want them to use the strongest one and I don't worry about it too much. But I do think like at its limit, we probably do know some things, like one of the things that stands out to me is if you have a technique that puts a high degree of stress or strain on a particular tissue, and then you maximize the program, like you maximize the volume throughput and you maximize the loading as far as you can push it, you can kind of guess which tissues are going to be the limiting factor, right? So going toward a technique that is pretty balanced across available tissues seems like a good idea. Now that has to be balanced. Like the counterpoint to that is like, well, you have to lift the most weight, and if doing some technique puts a lot of strain, like, okay, let's give a concrete example here. If somebody deadlifts with a round back technique, we can see mechanically that their spinal erectors are doing more work, and we can see that there's like a comparatively significant amount of force transfer that's going through the spinal segments, So if you maximize that person's program, like, yeah, that's probably the tissue that's most at risk. Now, we don't have to catastrophize that. We don't have to like freak out. I mean, about back injuries and things like that. Like those are things that can happen, but so can injuries occur to other tissues as well. If you don't like the back injury example, maybe it's like a wider stance squat being extra taxing on the adductors, or something along those lines. If you maximize that program, we can guess which tissues are going to probably, not definitely, but probably be the ones to suffer. Now, those tissues adapt and change and grow stronger. We know this, and that's good. Like that's a protective mechanism. There's just a limit to how far you can take that, and so that's not to say, like, there's all these caveats that we have to talk about because I brought up injuries, but that's fine. That's not to say that, like, if you squat with a wide stance, you're gonna injure your adductors tomorrow, but if you maximize that over a long period of time, you can see which tissues you're putting the most stress and strain through, and there's a limit to adaptation. So maybe that becomes a risk, maybe not. But the point I'm trying to make is, for me, like when it comes to deciding a technique, there's like this balance that needs to be struck between, okay, this is the technique that you're strongest with, and that's the sport. So do that, and then this is the technique that I think will probably lead to the best strength expression over the long term. So we don't always know that, and it's not a guarantee, but if I had somebody who, we'll stay with the ultra wide squat example, would I try to see if a narrower stance can work for them? Yeah, I would. But if it doesn't, if it's a David Wilson situation or something like that, I'm not going to freak out about that. Like, we'll continue to work at whatever stance is producing the best platform results, and so, like, he ends up being a pretty good example of this, I think. Like, he's found the stance that works for him, and regardless of how it looks on paper, like how you may textbook the thing, it's the thing that makes him the strongest on the platform.
Yeah, and to go back to like the rounded back example, the question of what do you do about a technique, and like, do you accept or do you try to change a technique? I think we're in, luckily, a good spot where, for the most part, my interventions for, like, say someone deadlifts with a really rounded back, I want to experiment and see if a more neutral back will be better for them. So what do? You probably hammer a lot of glute and hamstring work. You probably put them in some sort of variations that emphasize that point, and you try to coach them and try to guide them to a slightly more neutral back position. And I don't think any of those interventions would be harmful. I don't think there's any reason why getting stronger glutes and hamstrings would be a bad thing. And then if they just keep getting stronger glutes and hamstrings and their deadlift goes up, then that's great. But if they keep getting stronger glutes and hamstrings and they're still in a really rounded position and their deadlift also goes up, then that's great. If you do all those and nothing changes and their deadlift stays the same, then it's like, okay, clearly something here isn't working. You got to move on. So as far as making these technical changes, I tend not to view it as like, oh, this needs to happen this way. It's going to be, okay, let's try to guide you towards something a little bit more balanced. And luckily, the thing that will probably get you to that more balanced is probably just going to benefit you overall, no matter what. Or at least that's how I would try to program it. And then if it ends up in a good result, then we keep going in that direction. If it doesn't end up in a good result, then you have stronger glutes and hamstrings and not necessarily a stronger deadlift, which there could be worse things.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's easy to see like how that can happen in some other scenarios as well, like a chest fall pattern in the squat where the hips rise before the barbell rises. I think like the classic prescription for that is like direct quad work, but sometimes that doesn't seem to move the needle very much. So, something I tell my athletes a lot is that like developments of strength are seldom wasted. We may not, be utilizing stronger quads right now, but we will, it's just that, okay, so that maybe didn't pay off in this block, but it'll pay off in another couple blocks, once we continue to remove those roadblocks, those weakest links, so I agree with you in terms of like that being a good strategy for addressing some of those weaknesses and slowly over time kind of correcting technique. And the round back deadlift example, that one in particular, I've had some frustrating cases over the years where I've had lifters who lift with a round back style. We talk about it. They decide that they want to address it. And okay, so I'll help you do that. Part of it will be like just addressing the like the muscular weaknesses and things like that. The other part is like more integrated approach where we will practice the movement as we want to perform it, and that's always like a little bit tough, right? Because you've got to really humble yourself in terms of load selection, practice good technique, and lots of times there's not really a black and white. And round back deadlifting is a good example because once you start looking really closely, you see that basically all deadlifts are round back deadlifts, and you're just trying to decide what level is acceptable and what's not. And over time, it's real easy for that to shift, and, like week 1, yeah, that's a flat back. And then week 2 is like, well, yeah, it's a little bit more than week 1, but it's still pretty flat. Week 3, by week 8 or 10, you're back to doing it the old way. So it's tough to commit to that technique, especially when, you're a power lifter, you want to lift more weight, and it requires you to not do that sometimes for a long time. And I've had clients who we've kind of gone through this process with, and some of them don't like eventually get better, like some of it's just, they're not as strong with that technique. And they, like some people can, make the leap. And then some people seem to be unable to, or at least I've been unable to help them make that leap. In which case you go like, well, if you're a power lifter and you're interested in maximizing your total, then, maybe this ain't the way.
Yeah. I tend to, people are always like, oh, I see this all the time in people that I am around, but you compete, you have some sort of quote unquote poor technique. And then what you do after the meet is you take all the load off the bar and you just fix technique. And that's all you do for a block. And I have just never seen that pan out in a good way. And I really, really bias against doing these technical changes where you have to drastically reduce load, because like I would much rather you just get stronger and slowly morph your technique over time if there's some technique that I think will be better for you. But I just haven't seen someone say, okay, I'm going to take everything off, like all my strength away. I'm going to really hammer this technique and fix this thing. And I've never seen it pan out into, oh, they're clearly much stronger in a time frame that would clearly be better than if they just stuck technique. Like I see it all the time. They're like, oh, I hit it finally after 5 months, hit a 2.5 PR. You're like, what were you doing that whole time? Like I'm not, maybe that's just the rate of gain that they would have had, but why did you have to take all the load off the bar? And then often at the same time, you see that their lifts are like still pretty close to what they were doing previously because their body is just trying to self-organize itself. That's why I tend to be just like, I try not to worry about technique as long as it hits a comp standard. That is a huge caveat, because sometimes with so many athletes, I've had to say, okay, we're taking a lot of load off the bar so you can hit depth. But I just have never seen it pan out in a successful way where somebody goes, I know that this technique is what I need. And I get a little frustrated with coaches who, not to call anyone out, but who are so confident in what they think their their lifter's best technique is, that they're like, hey, we need to take so much load off the bar so that we can do this technique that I think is the best thing for you. Generally,
Yeah.
I think people get stronger.
Yeah, I don't typically see the need to do that either, like back in the day, I lived in Italy, and I was training with a group of people. There was a coach who I knew, and he was really good to me, and a good coach overall, but it's a funny story and just too good to pass up, so I'm telling it. um, I was at his gym, training and kind of hanging out, watching him do his coaching thing. And he had this lifter who was training in a bench shirt. And, he did whatever the lift was. I forget what the weight was, but, he brings it down, touches, bam, crushes it, And, I'm just making small talk. I said, oh, that looked really good. What's he going to go up to from here? And he goes, oh, no, we stay here today. And I'm like, why? And he's like, when he pressed, his elbow did this. And he like did this wobbling motion. His elbow did this. I said, okay. But still, it was very easy, and he goes, the technique, it must be beautiful. And I said, no, the weight, it must be heavy. I mean, not to say that there's never a time to have like lighter technique sessions. Of course there is, that's a strategy that you can use. But, it's just to reiterate the point. I think, the name of the game is getting stronger. And I like what you said as well about technique evolving over time. I think that's super important. It just does, you will change your technique over time. Stances get a little wider, a little narrow. You'll push into your quads a little bit more or a little bit less. As different things happen in your life over the course of your career, as different movements get stronger or weaker, like there's just different needs, and you can figure this out. That's we talk about athletic, like movement intelligence, just your ability to solve movement problems. This is, we started off kind of talking about equipped or like semi-equipped stuff, and it's even more apparent with equipped lifting because the technique it is really precise, and little things do matter even more. But athletes are still athletes. Powerlifters are athletes. You have to solve movement problems, and kind of giving people space to figure that out, I think, is important. Coaches can provide some guidance on how to do that. But ultimately, it's coming down to the athlete. The athlete has to feel what a strong brace feels like, and you'll notice different things. And it sounds weird to talk about some of this stuff sometimes, but like I notice for myself, there's a place that, like I said, it sounds weird, but there's a place that I put my tongue against the roof of my mouth that is just better for bracing, And when you tell me that a coach is supposed to notice stuff like that, of course not, obviously not. Like nobody's coaching at that like that anyway, but there are details to your technique that you will notice when you do it enough times, and the big rocks are going to come into place sooner than the little micro details, so like we can give guidance, and I think even more useful than guidance is just different drills, different opportunities to try on different movement solutions and see what's working best, what feels like, oh man, I really nailed it that time. Like I really produced a lot of power that time, and then others are less successful. And so you figure it out, that's the other thing. Like this isn't a game of maximizing a block or two, it's much longer term than that.
Yeah. The thing I kind of want to get into that I think would be interesting is my and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but my perspective on what is strength, because strength is a skill. And in my mind, technique is, there's like layers to this, obviously. And what I find really interesting is when people are really zealous about technique, they're really zealous about conscious technique, like the conscious cues that you're giving someone and the conscious like movements that you're trying to do. And I put my, I pull down on my back and I bend the bar and those kind of cues, and they put a lot of weight to those. And as far as I understand it, there is so many layers to this where it blends from this conscious technique, and it kind of gets a little less conscious and a little less conscious and a little less conscious until you're at the point where it's just your muscles, like you're just motor unit recruitment that you like theoretically you're voluntarily controlling it, but you don't actually consciously have any idea what's going on. And there's that blend, and people put a lot of emphasis on that first little like layer. And maybe like a second bit of that second layer of like, oh, we're going to try this and this. But I kind of tend to think that like I don't worry as much about that top layer because it's just that top layer, and I'll put some weight on it. But in general, what I want you to do is I want you to figure out movement solutions unconsciously, which is why I am such a proponent of movement variation and constraints on a movement to like show you what the strongest way to move is for you at that time. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. Something that you mentioned a minute ago as well is efficiency. And this comes up a lot, and I'll kind of use my weird deadlift style as an example. Like the deep knee bend prior to initiating the pull off the floor. People ask me a lot, like, why do you do that? And like, there's subtext here, right? And like some people are more overt about it than others, but like, it's like, why do you do that? Don't you see that like your hips rise before the bar breaks the floor? Why not just adopt that position? Like, isn't this inefficient? And I mean, there's a bunch of things going on here, right? Like, first of all, like, I think we sometimes have the wrong idea about like what efficiency is. Like, is it extraneous movement before the bar starts moving? Yeah. But so, I mean, I guess technically it's inefficient, but who cares? Like it's like a little bit of pre-movement. It's not highly intense. You're not like burning up
It's also
ATP
inefficient
or
to
something.
walk to the bar.
Yeah. I mean, who
Yeah.
cares? It's like, yeah, it's inefficient, but like there's no consequences, The other thing is like, well, why not just start with a higher hip position? That's a valid question to me, but there are other things going on. Like, so in my case, I know that I feel like I can lock my back in to the position that I want a little bit more securely when I do this, So yeah, there's some hip rise, but because there's this like pre-movement, I'm able to more effectively get into the position that feels good to me, and over time that's become the stronger technique as well. So yeah, I could do it the other way, but there's like little, I don't know if it's quite like imperceptible, but it would be definitely very hard to see differences in like my position that feels like it matters a lot to me, and it definitely matters in terms of like how much can I lift and what have I been able to lift safely as well. And so, me coming in with a history of back injuries at this point, so stuff like that matters a lot too. And, there's things like this. Like I heard a coach kind of complaining, it was yesterday or today, about, people who like approach the deadlift bar and they're standing there and they like take a big breath and brace and they like flex their lats and then they immediately like bend over and lose like all the brace and all the lat tension and stuff like that. Like, these idiots, and maybe they're idiots. I don't know. But also maybe like all this kind of pre-movement is not exactly about like the mechanics, like where is your skeleton in space? Like there's this whole nervous system coordination aspect of it too. And maybe just like feeling that before you initiate the movement sequence just helps you remember the things better, you know? So there's other reasons why you may want to do this. And, did you burn up some microgram of ATP doing that? Yeah, maybe, but you executed the movement better and thus lifted more weight in competition. Like that's the thing to care about.
Yeah. As long as load on the bar goes up, like
Pretty
you can't
simple,
argue
right?
with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, let me tell you something that I know about you. Your lifting is important to you. It's probably one of your biggest priorities. And for people like us, nothing compares to the feeling that you get when you set a new PR. That feeling of being the best that you've ever been, of doing something that you've never done before. This is what we're all after, and it's also what RTS specializes in. Getting you the absolute best program possible so that you can hit new PRs and reach your goals. We call it radically individualized training, and we're really good at it. Whether we need to account for busy schedules or equipment limitations, or precisely turn the dials and get the details of the program just right, we have the tools and the experience to guide your lifting to the next level. To us, coaching is all about leadership, relationship, and creative problem solving. A coach should be poised to help you make tough decisions about training and competing so that you can continually grow in your development. And of course, a coach should be a first-rate problem solver, especially when it comes to your training, technique, and strategy. Now, all this has to be built off of a really strong, professional coaching relationship that emphasizes trust and respect. Additionally, RTS coaches are not on an island. We have a strong network of professionals to reach out to, so if you find yourself in need of some specific expertise, say in the realm of nutrition or injury management or sports psychology, there's a deep expertise available there too. For more information, go to store.reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on coaching. That's store.reactivetrainingsystems.com, then click on coaching. Hope to see you on the team soon.
And funny is on a lot of podcasts where they start talking about technique, they bring on these big lifters. And you start talking to the lifter and you start getting into their program and you're like, okay, and what is your technique? And then everybody just like has this list of things. I always find that so interesting. I'm glad we're not doing that, because it's like, I always listen to those and I'm like, okay, here's a long list of things that you could do. Like, cool, thank you. I will probably not necessarily address any of those because I just have never found a lot of use in trying to replicate what somebody who squats like 900 pounds is doing. To me, like I'm sure I'm doing a lot of the same stuff in a very similar way. And at the same time, I'm not like so worried about these very
It's akin
specific
to
things.
like talking about what music you listen to when you train. Like
Yeah.
maybe, yeah, I mean, it's important in some ways, and maybe you say something that I didn't know, and I go, oh yeah, that's a really good song. That'll really like
I'll put that on.
motivate my
See if I like
training
it.
in the next training block or something like that. Yeah, all right, that's great. But for the most part, I'm not. Yeah, lots of high-level lifters as well don't always know what it is that they're doing. I'm blanking on the example. I had an example for this as well. Like there was a
A lot of
lifter
people I
who was
could name
talking
drop,
about.
but I will
There was a
refrain.
lifter who was talking about like I forget what the cue was even, but they were talking about a cue that they really liked, that they really rely on. They think it's, just to put an example with this, I think it's really important to sit back in the squat and like keep vertical shins or something like that. But then if you look at them squat, they don't do that. Like maybe you're thinking it, but you're not doing it. So like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of those things where, I mean, this is a good thing we could maybe get into, is people giving cues at things that are good for them in their circumstance, but maybe they're not even doing it because what they didn't need the cue exactly. They needed to have the cue move them away from something else that they were doing and bring them more towards the middle. And if you cued someone else with that same cue, it might just not do anything.
Yeah.
Like I think about with my deadlift, my deadlift was a wreck for so many years because I was trying to use all the cues that people tell you, like, hey, pull slack really well, build a lot of tension off the floor. One of the big cues that I would always use when I was pulling sumo is like push through the floor, like it's a push and a pull. And I would try to do all these things and build tension and really deliberately push with my legs and stuff like that. And I kept getting just so stuck at lockout every single time. Like I have this bit that like it's not a real training block if I don't have one deadlift day that I want to just quit and leave the gym. Because I would just have this technical stuff happening. I'm like, this is so annoying to deal with. And then one day, and this I think is a good case, one anecdote for the kind of like self-organized model. One day I just got like really fed up and I went in to go pull some PR, like it was a conventional deadlift PR. And I was just like, man, screw this. I'm so annoyed with trying to do all these cues. And I just like went up and yanked the bar. And so the thing that would always catch me is I would have a really early lockout or really early knee lockout. And I would just get completely just stuck in the dead zone up at the top, like where I can't get my hips through. And so I got really frustrated and just like, I'm just going to pull on this thing. And I just yanked entirely with my back, which is what all the classic wisdom says to not like push that, not force that, not to. And then I hit the PR and I had really good looking technique while doing it. And I was like, wait, what the heck? And I didn't pull any slack. I just like, and then dropped down to the bar and just yanked it as hard as I could. And it didn't even, that single moved well. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But I didn't think anything of it. And then I went into my next block of deadlifts because that was like the last week. And my deadlifts were having the same problem of that early knee lock, just getting stuck at the top. And it took me several more weeks until like the last week of the block. I think I was running like a 6-week block. The last week of the block, I'd been so fed up with deadlifts just going terribly that I was like, I remember doing a specific thing last block when I pulled that single. What did I do? And I like tried a couple different ways on my warm-ups. And then like my last warm-up, I was like, I think I just like yanked with my back. And then I went to go pull, I was running like triples at that point, and I pulled just entirely with my back. No bracing. And the deadlifts, and like finally I hit this like huge breakthrough in the deadlifts moving, feeling better, and just looking visually a lot cleaner and more consistent. And ever since then, I have just like all the conventional wisdom that I will often tell my lifters of, hey, like try to push through the floor, try to wedge into the bar. I personally can't do, and it like disrupts my deadlift if I try to do anything but just yank really hard with my back. But
like an example of how different cues like matter to different lifters, like it just to highlight, it feels like you're doing that, but as you mentioned a few times, like visually it doesn't look like you're doing that, so it's what do you need to create the outcome, create the desired outcome, so like there's the visual elements of it, but there's also the validated by like actual weight on the bar. Going back some years, there was kind of this technical trend, which I think rightly or wrongly you could probably trace back to Kelly Starrett, and I don't know, I didn't follow a lot of his work super closely, like when he was at his height of popularity, but he at least got like typecast as being like the knees out guy, and everybody was always supposed to push knees out all the time, no matter what. And you ended up getting people that took that to its logical conclusion, just had knees way too far out. And then there's like this counter movement where all of a sudden somebody goes, no, you need to go knees in. And then a bunch of people go knees in and they're like, oh, this is gold. Like I'm, hitting PRs. Now everybody's like, oh, no, knees in is the way. Knees in is the way. Like, guys, it's the relative position, like for some of you, you probably should shove your knees out a little bit. For some of you, you should probably bring them in a little bit. It depends on which person are you, so like individual differences strikes again, I guess. But yeah. And I relate to what you're saying too about like sometimes the cues that are commonplace just don't produce the result that we want. I had something similar happen just in this last block, actually, for myself, where I was benching, coming into like competition prep time frame, and I just happened to see a video of a guy benching, and it was just really obvious the scapular control that he was using. Something about the angle that the video was shot at, like you could really see, he takes the bar out of the rack and you could really see the scapular control, like really emphasizing scapular depression. And I was like, oh yeah, that is a thing, and I kind of forgot about that a bit, So the next time I go out to the gym, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, let me kind of reconnect with this scapular control cue. And it was terrible, like, it feels like it should be good, it's hard to explain a little bit, but
I think
felt,
I can like sort of feel it as you're describing
it. Yeah. It felt like a good position, but everything was slow and sluggish and just not that strong, and I thought, oh, but it feels good, like let's let it ride for a couple weeks and it'll come around, but it didn't. And, I'm getting into the last week or two of the block, and, frustration sets in and you're just like, I'm just going to do it the normal way, go back to the normal way, and bench comes back to life and you're like, oh, yes, there was a reason that I had been doing it this way all this time. I mean, that's a good process. You do end up in those situations sometimes. You try it on, and sometimes it doesn't work. So you go back to the other thing. I would not recommend adopting the same timing that I did, like coming into like a comp prep period. But, sometimes ideas are powerful things. But I do think it's important to like try those things on, and sometimes they pan out, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, as far as like a lot of how I coach technique, including like the bigger variables like stance and grip width, I brought up earlier that I think a lot of coaches feel like they have this confidence of what someone should do. Like they can see something and they feel like they can just tell how someone should move. And there is a little bit of that. Obviously, we have seen a lot of people moving, and there's going to be some validity to that. But as far as stuff like stance width and grip width, I kind of leave it alone with the caveat of, hey, lifter, unless I'm programming it explicitly in, because I'm like, hey, I think somebody might be stronger with a wider grip or a closer grip, then I'll program it in, see how they do with it. But for a lot of those things, like a stance width in a squat, I will tell my lifters, hey, just so you know, I don't know exactly what is going to be the strongest stance for you. You don't necessarily either. Neither of us really know. What you need to do is, as you're squatting, play around with it. Play around with a slightly narrower, a slightly wider stance. I don't mind if you try to do something like maybe week to week, maybe try a different stance. My general preference though is if maybe like pick something for a block, like, hey, I'm going to try a slightly narrower stance for this cycle. See how it goes. And then just report back if it feels good or if it feels bad. And I've had a lot of lifters who say, I heard this thing online, or somebody told me this thing and I tried it and it worked great. And I'm like, perfect. That's great. I don't think me as the coach is I'm the person who needs to give you all 1,000 possible cues that you could try. But if you're messing around and you find something that really works, then I support that a lot. And I feel like a lot of coaches feel like their job is the designated cue giver, when I don't think that. I think that you should be helping someone, obviously, try to guide them towards a stronger technique. But like, I am much more of an advocate for like athlete exploration and saying, these are possible options for what you could do. I want you to try some of them and see what feels better. And then report back what feels better or what feels worse. Sometimes I will go as far as programming them in. Like for a bench width, I will often program a wider or a closer grip. But I don't think that I have the confidence, and I don't think a lot of other coaches should have the confidence in what exactly is the best way for their athlete to move. And I think that that's up to the athlete to determine.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about pretty small differences here, like your squat stance being, a couple inches wider, a couple inches narrower, from one block to the next. That's probably not a thing that you're picking up on via video, or even if you were in person, like you're probably not noticing that small degree of change. I mean, maybe you are, but it's going to be like a gut feeling. If you're being honest, it's going to be a gut feeling anyway. Like, your stance looks a little bit wider. Do you think it's wider? Yeah, I widened it out by, an inch on each side. Like, okay. So that's not something that you're going to like top down control anyway. I think it's got to be, more of a bottom up process. And like you say, like certain cues are going to resonate with people, and this kind of goes back to something that you said in the beginning about like looking at top lifters, and is that something that we should look at or not? I've got a lifter that I coach he's a strong dude, but he's not, competing internationally strong dude, during our work together, he has struggled with his squat technique. And one of the things that he figured out on his own was like, hey, if I round my back just a little bit, like there's a certain amount that's the exact right amount, but that makes his squat way better, like better in terms of the bar path is straight where it wasn't before. It's more comfortable for him. It's better balanced. Weights move faster, so there's like actual better force production with it. That would not be a thing that I would be like, oh yeah, you need to squat round back style, But, and like I said, it can, we've definitely like taken it a little bit too much on certain reps, and you can see what happens when you do that. But if he gets this position right, man, it looks way better. But it's not something that I would have thought of, and it's not something that you see like, oh, this is an elite technique hack or anything, But it's an appropriate technique shift for like his specific anthropometrics.
Something else that I was kind of thinking of is another case that I think for not being such a conscious technique zealot is you see people all the time who have something happen. I'm thinking a lot of Kyle Curvey just competed at this abs meet where he won, and he like tore his quad and then still went on to pull 900 pounds. And I'm like, I don't think that because like his technique for sure changed and he still pulled 900 pounds. He's not using the same setup, but there's clearly some other things that are obviously going on where you can still have a really, really high performance and succeed. And I've seen other people, like I think Derek Thistlethwaite was like squatting at some meet, and his right knee was just not taking it well. He still squatted like an all-time world record or something. And it's just, clearly there's something that's going on that's not just technique. Your body has so many solutions to a movement, and you don't need like all these cues to be the only thing. Like, I don't know. I find that so interesting when people get injured.
That's the thing that people mistakenly think about technique, right? Is that we're drilling technique. It needs to be the same. I want to do it the same way every time. And like there's a extent to which you try to keep things consistent, but they're never actually the same. And the further you push, the more differences are going to show up. So I don't think that's something to be fought against. Yeah, you want to take whatever technique you're strongest at and drill that technique, but just understand that variations will happen. Like when you're setting up, sometimes you're going to walk out and set your feet slightly unevenly. It's going to happen. But that's not a problem necessarily. Like you're building different movement solutions for a variety of different conditions. Like this is just normal. And the closer you look at technique, the more you see that these variations are just part of how skilled people move their bodies, in any sort of domain, like the blacksmith example. There's a blacksmith example that's like the textbook example of all this, but it happens in powerlifting as well. It's not something that you necessarily need to fight against. And there's even some benefit, I think. We're getting into maybe a different topic territory here, but like I think there's some benefit into leaning into that. And it's one of the reasons why, like when we do pivots, I like to include a bigger variety of movements. I like people to squat with different stances in pivots. Like it's funny to me because people are willing to like do close grip bench or wide grip bench, but you start saying like, I want you to squat with a wide stance or squat with a close stance. And there's a lot more people who are just like, no, I can't do that. Well, maybe we should be able to do that.
Yeah. I'm in that camp.
Yeah.
I probably should be less in the camp, but in my mind, it's like, you want to mess with my squat stance? But that's like a God-given thing that came to me. That should never be messed with.
I think there's benefit to it's just like the movement variety thing, like just in the same way that you would do like a close grip incline or something like that and not get too worked up about it if it's significantly lighter than your comp bench or anything like that. I think, sometimes we should do plat squats. Sometimes we should do like these wide stance sit back squats. And there's a variety of different things that you can do. And I don't know, this is maybe like some of my bias as a person and coach is that I think I generally want my athletes to have those capabilities. Is overhead press essential to your performance as a powerlifter? Definitely not. But if you can overhead press, I want you to continue to be able to overhead press, like I don't want to give up that capability just because we're focusing on powerlifting at this point in your life.
Yeah. Something that I thought of that I can't remember where I heard it from, but one thing that I try to aim for a lot as a coach is to include things that show athletes movement variability. So like with certain constraints, like a high bar squat or a pin squat, or one thing that I actually really like is using this is slightly tangential to what my main point, but using if I have someone who I'm noticing issues with bar path, or they have a certain sticking point where I just can tell that they're struggling to get the bar back over their shoulders or something like that, I will purposely include something like an incline and a close grip bench to show them both ends, because in a close grip, you have more horizontal distance to cover, right? You have a little bit more tuck, typically. And I want to show them that the hard end, and then like an incline shows them the easier end, and then like, hey, these are the two solutions, or here are two possible solutions.
Yeah.
Now, does that help your bench? but a large goal is showing them that variability so that they can, in some way, subconsciously or consciously, try to replicate it. And I think of that in terms of like percentage of 1RM is another constraint that you can put on someone. And I think it's interesting that obviously this does not explain nearly everything. But if you take someone who responds really well to like 75%, like you just find that across, whatever you're doing, they respond really well to like 75% work. I kind of theorize that one way that benefit people is by, like, obviously the closer you get to 1RM, the more constraints there are, the narrower their options for movement solutions are. But if you work at like 75%, there are quite a few different solutions to a task that would still get the weight up, right? And I'm curious if like doing lighter work like that has the goal of getting that volume in, getting in a lot of those other adaptations that we're looking for, but simultaneously gives someone the freedom to subconsciously move around in different ways that deviate from what their perceived 1RM technique would be at that time. They move around in different ways, and then slowly they kind of incorporate that movement variability and those different solutions into heavier work that then helps their 1RM go up, like their 100% increase. And I don't know, I've just always thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I think so. That's for sure part of what I'm thinking about with the program, stuff like that. We've got some strategies, roses and thorns come to mind that are in our programming library in the training lab. But when I've done those strategies back in the day, it was that was definitely part of the experience for me. Is like there's multiple sets in like this 70-75% range or something like that in the early cycles, and I would definitely feel like this, like we were talking about before, like sometimes your stance is subtly wider or subtly maybe even off center or something like that. And now, you go ahead with the set, and I think you learn something. I think you develop from being able to do that, and to that end, like, I think you can develop similarly from like higher rep, higher RPE stuff as well. So imagine like taking a set of 12 or something like that, up to a pretty high RPE, your first handful of reps, like, hold on, let me caveat this because I know that's hard for powerlifters to wrap their head around. You've got to do it enough that you don't freak out about it being 12. Like, we've got to do 12 enough that we can calm down and just do the work, yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's painful. It's going to suck. You do it anyway. And like, let's not make a big deal. The first handful of reps are pretty easy reps, and you can kind of settle into a rhythm and move around a little bit. Like today, I ended up doing a rep set in the squat. And for some reason today, sitting back into my squat felt a little bit better than really pushing forward. And I was able to kind of feel that out in the first handful of reps, and just kind of went with it, and it ended up being a good set. But then like you can shift that around a little bit as well, like if you get to rep 8, 9, 10, you're like, my glutes aren't going to have any more of this, well, then you can kind of push into the front a little bit and lean into the quads a little bit more. And, you learn something from all these experiences is what I'm getting at. And I think it's good to develop this like breadth of experience, because then like just exactly what you're saying, I think you can incorporate all that stuff down the road. You notice it during your warm-ups. And so it may not even be like a super conscious thing, but just like some days feel like subtly wider days, and so you put your feet like an inch wider on each side, and it's not that much. Nobody's going to notice, but it's just enough that that's the thing that you're feeling, and that leads to the performance that you need. you know?
It's so interesting. Like, I feel like I hear some coaches say that like technique has to be practiced in the most specific context, which to them means like 90% or 80% with a competition movement. And like the breadth of things that influence technique and can alter technique. Like obviously there's some variations that people will specifically use. So sometimes obviously it's on the nose, like it's super on the nose of I'm using a tempo variation to highlight some sort of technical aspect or bring the lifter's attention to something. But it can be even less on the nose. It can be like I said, like a close grip bench. There's going to be some sort of tricep benefit from a close grip bench, but I will often use it to expose someone to different bar paths so that they can find that solution. And a lot of people's definitions of what technique work is 80 to 90% or above of something that's a competition max. And they're like, oh, that is going to give you the greatest technical adaptations because you have the highest amount of constraints. It's the most specific. And the breadth of what you can do to, like programming wise, to fix or not fix, like change and strengthen someone's technique include things like weird variations. Like, you know what else I've done that I think is funny is 1 1/4 bench or 1 1/4 squats for people who need that bottom range and bottom range of motion work is a very interesting tool for that. But like that's an example of something that is really atypical that I've actually used for quite a few people. Or like, actually another tangent, but one of my favorite deadlift variations is a touch and go deadlift because I find that it really benefits people at that bottom position, and it really, like for some people, it feels like they know how to deadlift suddenly. And it's not like they're bouncing it's off the floor, but it's like, have you ever done them?
Like a glass floor deadlift, I think I've heard people call it.
Yeah, probably the same thing, but where you have to control it just enough so that you don't like set the weight fully in the ground. You just try to tap it as lightly as possible. And some people just feel like they suddenly know how to deadlift after they do it because they're like, oh, getting into that bottom position with a lot of control and then starting there is really beneficial for them. But
This
anyway,
is what like the bottom tension, the bottom position. Yeah, I mean I can see where that would be potentially really beneficial for a deadlift. And that's a lot of what like my intent from programming stuff like pause deadlifts is often going to like a similar place, but I can definitely see how like putting it after an eccentric phase is, just a different way to modify that experience so that, you're feeling out what that position is like.
yeah. But I find it interesting the breadth of things that will enhance someone's technique. Like you were saying, I have a lifter who would do a lot of really light work, and he's newer, and his bar path would just be all over the place on bench. And as he had that variability, we would do all this light work, and like we would get to heavier loads at first before we did all this stuff, and his bar path would just be really out of the groove consistently. And then we did a ton of this really like light 60 to 70% work for higher reps. And he just felt so many different variations of how to move the bar that suddenly his top end was like, oh, okay, I know what it feels like to use this type of bar path. And his bench rapidly increased because he could find inefficient way where if he hadn't done that lighter work, I don't think he would have been exposed to as many different variations as he could have.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And I really like the variety of movements in terms of helping people figure out movement solutions. I think it's super important for the bench in particular. There are more, like there's a greater variety of movements available to training the bench, but the bench and the deadlift are both, like I think of them as two-part movements where there's this initial drive phase and then there's a kind of a lockout phase, and they're different in terms of their trajectory, whereas the squat tends to be kind of all the same thing. It's just, it's like the squat clocks for me as like one movement, but the bench and the deadlift are kind of two phases. So they both, I think, benefit from using variations specifically to kind of address that. Like I'll use variations to target like bottom end bar path and other variations to target like top end bar path. And then of course you have to integrate these together into like one coherent skill, but in terms of like just the refinement of the movement itself, I think it's sometimes beneficial to break it down, like, yeah, the power lifts are simple movements, but you're not doing it with a broomstick, like you have to execute it very well with the most weight that you've ever lifted. And like you said, the closer you get to that, the more, the fewer options you have, and like the more precise you have to be. So I think it's like on the surface, very simple technique, but to take it beyond technique and go into what I would call sport form is a different level entirely. Shh. There is a secret to great training programs, but it's not a magic set and rep scheme or this one weird exercise that powerlifting pros don't want you to know about. The secret is in your training log. You see, years ago, we began developing tools to help you unlock these secrets, and we've been putting them online for free ever since. That's right, it's free for everybody. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? People have been logging training forever, and you're right, but the secret isn't just in keeping a logbook. It's using that log to make better training decisions. That's the real secret. This is where the RTS training log excels. You haven't done SSB squats in 3 months and you're wondering what your target weight should be? We can help you with that. Did you overshoot on your top set and you're wondering if you should adjust your back offsets? We can help you with that too. Are you building the most important training block of this year and you're wondering what your most highly effective blocks have in common? Yep, we got you covered there too. There's more. There's a lot more. And yes, it is all free. Not just a free trial, not free with ads, just regular free. You go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, then you click on apps, sign up for a login, and you're in.